Okay, Chapter 4: Development, Meaning and Definition, Misconceptions and Realities of Development Strategies and Women. At the end of the chapter, you will know the following: 1. The meaning and definition of development. 2. An analysis of the different models of production, development. 3. Misconceptions and realities of past development strategies. 4. Impact of development strategies on women. During the last few decades, there has been a vast literature on women and development. This led to an increasing awareness of the nature and extents of women's participation in development. In the context of economic and social planning, women's issues that was once thought of as no more than welfare issues have become issues of concern because it is being realized that nations as a whole suffers losses when women are excluded from decision making, are poorly educated, overworked, and in poor health. The virtual exclusion of women, their lives, work, and struggles can be understood at the theoretical level from an analysis and review of the dominant perspectives in development theory and model. Development has become a slogan of global aspirations and social change effort. Meaning and definition of development. In 1975, Dag Hammarskjöld report states that development is a total comprehensive process informed by a value-loaded vision and shaped around 5 pillars. 1. Satisfaction in human needs, both material and political. 2. Self-reliance. 3. Endogenous growth. 4. Harmony with the environment. And 5. Structural transformation in the economy, society, and polity. Development is not merely an economic and political concept, it is more fundamentally a process of culture and civilization, and the world needs culture alternatives to the dominant Western paradigm of development. Charlton, 1983. Definition. In 1994, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Boutros Ghali, defined development as a decisive factor in shaping our world, and it will define relations among people, shape the behavior of nations, and determine the ecological nature of the planet. Today, development is in crisis. First, there is crisis of complexity. Second, we have realized that development has no single definition. No single strategy has been immune from failure. There is no certain path to success. The context in which the study in which developments as occur are ethical issues, the structures of the international system, Western domination in development, and overall subordination of women. In summary, a development process that addresses the needs and concerns of women and children as well as of men will satisfy human needs, material, cultural, and political growth from within a society or culture, and express the priorities of the women as well as of the men in that society, involve structural transformation for the reason that without transformation women will remain marginal or political decisions, reverse the trends of militarization, police stats, and political repression while realizing minimal levels of political stability, rest on the indigenous culture rather than on Western concepts and strategies, and be in harmony with the natural environment. An analysis of different models. There are 3 main strategies of development. 1. Trickle-down strategy. 2. Basic needs strategy. 3. Structural adjustment program. Trickle-down strategy. This was based on the assumption that economic growth would eradicate poverty. As the name implies, this strategy assumes that these benefits of growth would trickle down automatically from the rich to the poor. The trickle-down strategy was popular in the 1950s and 1960s. It was marked by the emergence of the newly independent nations such as India and Pakistan, which were under British colonial rule, and by the political struggle of the Cold War. The nation-state was a new evolution that emerged after the Second World War in 1945. In the perspective of the United Nations was established with the idea and belief that all newly created nation-states should be equal in both political and economic aspects. As a consequence of this belief, the concept of economic development was mainly considered as an activity of the nation-states rather than an activity of local communities and individuals. This conceptual idea led to the recognition of the disparity of wealth between nation-states, especially focusing on the former colonial regimes and the newly created independent states. The assumption was that once growth was achieved by the rich nation-state, wealth would trickle down to the poor. Consequently, the emphasis was on how poor countries could become rich. The dominant analysis was that rich countries representing the first world were industrialized, while poor countries representing the third world were largely agricultural. During this period, it was also confirmed that the significant difference between the rich and the poor countries was technology and industrialization. So, to become rich, countries were required to build up the industrial sector, particularly manufacturing. Economic growth was regarded as the key to alleviating poverty and therefore the priority for development. The emergence and development of nation-states, however, took place in a geopolitical context of unequal power relations. As such, poverty and unemployment became key issues that had to be addressed in order to win the political legitimacy. Another important issue was that during this time, growth models like trickle-down was promoted by the Anglo-American economists and sociologists to guide the former colonies to take an economic takeoff. The path to development became identified with advancement towards some models of modern societies, which frequently meant countries like the USA and Europe, representing the first world countries. In this context, a number of developed countries came to be structured as welfare states with safety nets that were meant to curb the excesses of the market, ensuring social development for all. In congruence with this aspect, the concept of international development cooperation, as well as bilateral and multilateral aid programs developed for the newly independent countries which were engaged in restoring, reforming, and developing their destroyed economic system with the aim of promoting economic growth. The developed North felt the need to provide aid to the developing South, as the underdeveloped countries, for example, mostly countries of Africa, South America, and South and Southeast Asia, representing the South and Third World countries, were characterized as having stagnant economies and traditional societies. Thus, the economic takeoff of these countries were understood in terms of capital formation and monetized market society. This type of development thinking made the governments of poor countries to believe that if they introduced enough technology and removed the obstacles of economic growth, such as the attitudes, beliefs, characteristics of traditional societies, it will result in the growth of the nation states. This strategy was highly appreciated by the new developing nations during that time, mostly India and Pakistan, but now Bangladesh, that were searching for procedures to generate wealth to rebuild their country's growth and development and eradicate poverty. However, even with this strategy, it was evident that the trickle-down model did not bring any remarkable effect. The assumption that economic growth would eradicate poverty was nullified by increase in employment poverty, new inquiries, new inequities, and intractable poverty in the developing world. For example, in Bangladesh, we have seen that with the introducing technology in the agricultural sector, it has resulted in growing unemployment, resulting in increased poverty among the people who sustain their lives in an agricultural society and produce their work manually. Thus, the mechanization of the agricultural system brought about the loss of work for many poor agriculturists, and they even failed to receive the benefits of developing resulting from the introduction of technology in the agricultural system prevailing in the country. Despite its defects, this strategy is still very much active because of vested interest groups in the society who have benefited from this system. The continuum of power and powerlessness has thus become a priority factor in shaping and designing the development paradigms. If the trickle-down strategy was inappropriate, inadequate before, it is even more inadequate today. Its failure is due to a number of factors that led to certain misconceptions. For example, it was based on the misconception that wealth generated in a country will remain in the country. However, this has proved to be false, and the correct conception is that today we live in a world where trillions of dollars change hands every day in the global financial market. The effect of globalization has shattered the idea of trickle-down theory, because instead of trickling down the wealth is being transferred to the rich countries already wealthy as the cost of the poorer sections of the society, thus increasing the extent of poverty in these countries. Bangladesh is a country where the richer section of the population has been transferring their wealth to the rich countries, thus turning the country into an impoverished nation. Another misconception of this model is that there are limits to wealth collection. So when people at the top have reached their limits, it is natural that they will distribute the excess wealth by trickling down to those who are in need, specifically the poorer sections. But in practice, this is far more from reality, as the actual fact remains that, as per UNDP Human Development Report 1994, the gap in the income between the richest 20% has increased to from 40 times greater than that of the poorest 20% in 1960 to 61 times greater than that in 1993. This statistic clearly indicates that there are no limitations to wealth collection or accumulation. In addition, this model also concentrates on the fact that poverty and wealth generation are separate and unrelated processes. However, in actual fact is that impoverishment and wealth accumulation are interlinked. Poverty is not a static phenomenon, but the result of an ongoing process of impoverishment related to the loss of livelihood resources. For example, due to natural calamities, when poor people lose all their livelihood resources, they become more poorer, or those who were not considered as poor become poor by the loss of their existing livelihood resources. Wealth, on the other hand, is generated through obtaining resources as cheaply as possible, whether in the form of natural resources or cheap human labor. Lastly, it may be mentioned that once surplus is generated through economic growth, there are no social barriers to the trickling down of wealth. This is totally wrong, because we live in stratified societies where inequalities have become institutionalized. There are all kinds of barriers that maintain the stratification system, including gender sensitivity, religion, class, and caste. Wealth cannot automatically flow through these barriers if these barriers are not removed first. For example, in many countries, even if land were available, women's rights to land ownership need to be established as a priority issue. In the context of Bangladesh, it is a significant fact that although nowadays urban women have the right to own property, in own land. This issue has not been established in the rural areas where about 80% of the women of the country resides, and they suffer from all the ill effects of lack of ownership of land. Thus, it is evident that the trickle-down strategy lacks gender sensitivity. A major flaw of this development strategy is the over-concentration of the aspect of generation of wealth without any attention given to how the gender hierarchy and other institutionalized barriers needs to address before wealth can be equitably distributed. The Basic Needs Strategy. In 1970s, the Basic Needs Strategy came out as a new approach stating that the pursuit of growth with equity or a strategy of targeting basic human needs would succeed where economic growth failed. In the 1950s and 60s, the focus was on the economic development of the nation, which was seen as the key actor in the eradication of poverty. By the 1990s, in many countries, the state was evaluated in being ineffective in dealing with poverty issues. It was thought that state intervention, including the governmental allocation of resources, was generally inefficient. Central planning procedures ceased to be workable. It also proved that the overemphasis on the generation of wealth had also generated processes that led to the exploitation of resources by the powerful across and within nations. As a consequence, developing agencies began to focus their attention on the basic needs and entitlements of the poor. The main issues of concern were employment, policies for direct poverty alleviations, improving the distribution of income, and the satisfaction of basic human needs. The argument was that social development, secure livelihoods, and the various dimensions of poverty have to be dealt with directly and simultaneously rather than uncertain and ad hoc side effects of economic growth. These possible avenues of action were implied, for example, active intervention of action by development agencies turning to non-governmental organizations, NGOs, for service delivery, reforming the state. All these three possibilities were explored and carried out by different groups at different times with varying degrees of success. For example, in the case of Bangladesh, it is worth mentioning the many developing agencies, specifically the International Labour Organization (ILO), was the first to focus on the basic needs of the poor, providing food, shelter, and clothing. This approach have included two more aspects, that is education and health. The non-governmental organizations (NGOs) have proved their worth in delivering appropriate and adequate service to the poor in the rural areas of Bangladesh. And the third area of reforming the state, the different government regimes have attempted to reform the state in different sectors. However, the main problem included the difficulties in the process of implementation of any reform activity undertaken during the different regimes. Thus, despite the good intentions identified in the basic needs strategy, it failed to root out the poverty. The main reason was that the model did not address the fundamental process of economic growth as simultaneously a process of wealth accumulation and a process of impoverishment. This strategy did not question modes of production and consumption and further assumed that economic growth would generate the capital required to address basic needs. Reliance was placed on market forces to develop human capital in terms of education, training, skill development, and manpower planning. Although the strategy did focus on the needs of the poor, there is a misconception in the strategy, the misconception being that poverty is the result of unequal distribution of wealth and so can be put right across the resources once goods are distributed equally. However, in real situation is that poverty is more than just a problem of distribution. Therefore, the problem lies much deeper in the very structure of the economy, in the modes of production and consumption. In this construction of wealth as exclusive control of resources and commodities. This scenario is very vivid in the context of Bangladesh, where we experience that it is the rich class who are mainly engaged in the modes of production and consumption, resulting in the construction of wealth and finally exclusive control in their hands. Here, the poor section are completely ignored or neglected as having no resources on their own, or even they are usually seen exploited by the conception of the middlemen. Structural adjustment strategy. In the late 1970s and 80s, the world economies were in recession or threatening to go into recession. Many countries recorded negative growth rates in 1985 for the first time. Even the economically successfully East and Southeast Asian regions, where countries like Japan, Hong Kong, South Korea, and Taiwan, for example, experienced reduced economic growth. Since the early 1980s, economies throughout the world have experienced rapid transformation. Growth could not longer be taken for granted and attention. They shifted the economic reconstructing and economic reforms as many countries experienced debt crisis, resulting in the promotion of structural adjustment strategies. The term structural adjustment usually refers to processes by which many developing countries are reshaping their economies to be more free market oriented. SAP was implemented in many countries of the South in order to speedily remove external imbalance of payment in debtor countries. The main components of the reforms, commonly referred to economic structuring or transformation, were remarkably similar in developing countries. This included reduction in government spending, privatization of the government firms, more efforts on economic efficiency, and trade liberalization. In the international financial institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund (IMF) set a package of reforms called Structural Adjustment Programs (SAP) as a condition for obtaining loans from the debtor countries. Indeed, the premise of SAPs is that market focus will automatically bring out an efficient, healthy, and productive economy in the long run. Hence, less government intervention, the better. In order to obtain global free trade, government were urged to halt the production or subsidy of goods and services. In the 1990s, developing countries have continued to structure the fundamentals of their economies, for example, by cutting down on state subsidized services, lowering inflation rates, maintaining high savings and investments rates, trading with other economies, and encouraging foreign investments. Emphasis on debt repayment shifted the priorities for government spending away from the public sector and social services such as health, education, and food subsidies to areas where production for internationally tradable goods could be stimulated in order to produce goods in exchange for foreign currency. This approach postulated the need for free market mechanisms and the importance of the private sector as providers of dynamics for economic growth. This shift occurred in the climate of global restructuring that was taking place in the international framework. The critique of such institutions like the World Bank and the IMF was that states were not doing their work. We and Heisner, 1995. So pressures were placed on governments to shift to market economy and to privatization processes. The dictates of the powerful financial institutions did not pass unquestioned. Together with external pressures, there were internal pressures within the developing countries to address basic livelihood needs. A number of nation states, especially those that had gained economic power, were resistant to external impositions. The less robust countries found that far from being recipients of capital from abroad, they were found to make net transfers of resources to the rich countries, and Bangladesh may be included in this group. As a result of financial restructuring, commodity livelihoods have been greatly affected by externally controlled commodities and stock markets, foreign exchange system structural adjustments for the payments of national debts to international creditors. The consequences generated by these include cutback in food subsidies, education and healthcare system, public transport, manipulation of private prices of essential goods and services, and natural commodities growth for export, production of surplus leading not necessarily to the generation of wealth, lowering wages and locally produced commodity prices, other forms of infrastructural support on which the poor depend, and currency fluctuations leading to unstable incomes for individuals and nations. Although SAP strategy has generally been perceived to have failed in the 1980s, it is still being advocated because of a serious misconception that the underlying assumption that being that without state intervention, a profit-driven market by itself can and will supply all needs. Therefore, SAP can put in place to reduce the role of the state and to expand the role of the market. However, the truth is that the market is not a level playing field as noted by Antrobus 1995. Because the market only responds to those who have the capacity to participate in it, it cannot then respond to the poor. This is true for individuals, families, communities, and countries. Poor people and poor countries end up having to sell all they have. To present a real example from Bangladesh, it is found that during the festival time, especially Eid al-Fitr, the largest Muslim festival taking place after 1 month of Ramzan, it is usually the middle class who, by maintaining their standard of living and going into competition to maintain social prestige, become poor by purchasing commodity beyond their means and ending up selling everything they have. To include, it may be said that the structural adjustment strategy, overwhelmingly biased towards income generation, regardless of social and environmental costs, is just likely to exacerbate poverty, inequalities, and unsustainable development. Impact of development strategies on women. A discussion on the three main strategies of development clearly indicates that women have been marginalized by all the three models. For example, the trickle-down strategy lacked gender sensitivity. A major flaw of this strategy was its over-emphasis with the generation of wealth without any attention given to as to how the gender hierarchy and other institutionalized barriers needs to be addressed before wealth could be equitably redistributed. The basic needs strategy re-emphasized that the feminization of poverty has occurred not just because women have less, but because their unpaid and underpaid labor as well as their bodies have become resources exploited by others for the generation of wealth. For example, where a poor father has to sell his daughter for reasons of poverty. This is a common scenario in rural Bangladesh, although the needs of some women can be met through the provision of educational and employment opportunities. The majority of women need an economy that does not exploit them as shadow subsidies. The impact of structural adjustment strategy is particularly severe for the following reasons. In the rural sector, women's livelihoods tend to be more resource-based than money-based. The impact of SAP affects women more than men. When resources are valued in terms of monetary calculations and not in terms of livelihood needs and uses, women are particularly affected. Some resources, for example, particularly food crops, may have no monetary value in the market economy, yet may feed people and save lives. In the gender division of labor, women are generally allocated the responsibility for family well-being, and the state decides to abdicate its responsibility and cuts back on social services because they do not generate income. The burden of commodity care becomes once more women's unpaid work. Women's double burden increases with the serious repercussions on their employment opportunities in the waged labor market. Reforms have presented opportunities for as well as inflicted costs upon women in many countries of South Asia where structural adjustment programs has been imposed. Women have traditionally experienced some form of discrimination. A detailed account of the impact of structural adjustment strategy on women is provided in Chapter 11. Thank you. Bye.